hopefully we are ready. Hello everyone, I'm Jiayu. I'm Assistant Professor of Center for Social Research in Guanghua Management School at Peking University. And I'm so honored to be the host of today's keynote speech. And actually the keynote speech is part of the first international conference on family and fertility hosted by Center for Social Research of Peking University, Center on Contemporary China of Princeton University, and panel on family behavior in East Asia and Southern Europe of IUSSP. So I also welcome you to join the following parts of our conference. And you may scan the QR code I just shared and follow the WeChat official account of our center. And there are a lot of details there. And let me also thank the Office of International Relations of Peking University, who sponsored the keynote speech. Then let me introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Lesthaeghe. And Professor Lesthaeghe is Emeritus Professor of Demography and Social Science Research Method of the Free University of Brussels. As a sociologist and demographer, Professor Lesthaeghe is a foreign member of National Academy of Sciences of the United States, a member of the Royal Academy of Brussels, and a foreign member of the Dutch Academy and the American Philosophical Society. So Professor Lesthaeghe has won so many awards in social science study, such as the Ernest John Sovereign Prize of the FWO, which is the highest Belgian National Science Foundation award in the social sciences and humanities. It means that for every 5 years, they will only choose one distinguished scholar to receive the award. And he also received the 2008 Lifetime Award for the International Union of the Scientific Study of Population, which is the largest population study academy in the world. And also, according to a survey of more than 600 demographers, Professor Lesthaeghe is also selected as one of the 10 most influential demographers in the period of 1950 to 2000. And the most known work of Professor Lesthaeghe includes the fertility transition in Europe, the demography of sub-Saharan African marriage and fertility patterns, demographic modeling of fertility postponement, and so on. And Professor Lesthaeghe is also the first scholar who proposed the second demographic transition theory, which is the most frequently used framework in explaining the sub-replacement level fertility and family behavior changes in the world in the past 3 decades. And it is also one of the most important theoretical frameworks in today's demographic study. So if you ever study any demography or family sociology, you must be really familiar with this second demographic transition theory. So in today's talk, Professor Lesthaeghe will introduce his most recent work on the global rise of cohabitation, which is a signal element of the second demographic transition. So let us welcome Professor Lesthaeghe with our warmest applause. So you can start, Professor.
Okay. Okay, I do the share screen now.
Yeah, I stopped sharing mine. You can share yours.
Oh, I should have my stuff ready. All I have is my computer screen, and the other one is open. Yeah, share screen. No. Okay. There we go. Share. Okay.
Yes, we can see it.
You can see it now.
Yeah.
I'm putting on the slideshow. Okay. You got all that? Okay.
Yeah, we can all see that.
All right. So today's talk will be indeed about trying to understand the rise of premarital condition in the various continents as it was not just limited to a tiny part of Europe, as was originally thought in the 1990s and even until 2000. In order to do that, we will in fact make a distinction between the three levels of factors that contribute to premarital cohabitation. And they are, of course, not mutually exclusive. That means that they can exist in combination. And most often than not, that is the case. That is combinations of the three. But analytically, we have to make that distinction. And the first one is an old historical pattern, which is still conditioning the current patterns. The second one is the pattern of disadvantage. And then cohabitation is seen as the equivalent of the poor man's marriage. That is, it is the disadvantage, economic disadvantage, which prevents people from marrying and opting for cohabitation instead. And the third one, and it's probably the most recent one, emerging basically after the 1960s, that is the second demographic transition feature, abbreviated as SDT, and that is a complete articulation of individual autonomy in choosing your partner. So this has nothing to do with tradition. In fact, it's breaking traditions. It's a form of non-conformism, and it's also conditioned by, I think, a choice for more gender equality. So women, the gender gap in the second demographic transition form of cohabitation tends to be smaller than in the previous two. Now, let's look at the very first one, that is the ethno-historical patterns, because I will base my talk, structure my talk on four major kinship systems that have existed historically. And here they are in red. To start with, the Asian and the North African patriarchal system. It's characterized actually by arranged marriages, and they are often endogamous within the family or endogamous within the social castes, like in India. They have a strong patriarchal control over daughters and wives. In fact, women leave their own family and join the family of their spouse. There is a son preference, and very important in this particular system, there is a dowry, i.e. there is a transfer of capital from the woman's family to the husband's family. In fact, the woman takes away a part of the capital that belongs to her own family. Her brothers, of course, will do the opposite, and they will bring it in upon their marriage. So there's a circulation, but it's a circulation within a small circle. And that circle can be, of course, like a caste or a social class, or even your own family system, which would then leading to a typical form of arranged marriage, which is cross-cousin marriage. That is, you would marry as a man, as a woman, you would marry your husband as your first cousin. And that is called a cross-cousin marriage. And that is also quite frequently found in Asian and North African patriarchal structures. Of course, they have changed over time, but these are the historical links that still have a very important role to play. And of course, since they are arranged and since there's strong control over who marries whom, these things are hostile to cohabitation because cohabitation is based entirely on free partner choice. Then the second one, which is actually historically an offshoot of the first one, but was fundamentally changed by Christianity, and this is the conjugal marriage. If we look back into the 18th and 19th century, there were various pockets in Europe which still had high frequencies of cohabitation, but by the 19th century and by the 20th century, they virtually all disappeared. There are a few exceptions. The most best known one is Iceland, which is an isolated island there in the middle of the Atlantic, but there always had cohabitation. But apart from that, there are hardly any pockets that were left by, let's say, 1920. Then after the Second World War, Europe had a major wave of secularization. The post-materialism phenomenon is emerging, and we have a strong articulation of individual autonomy. That, of course, is the basis of the second demographic transition part of the cohabitation. But that's not the only one. There was a competitor, and that competitor was basically due to the economic system change in Central and Eastern Europe from communism to capitalism. And that was, of course, hard on the lower classes, on the less educated, on the poorer people. And that spurred on a reaction of the type of the pattern of disadvantage. So the third one is what I called, for any lack of any better label, Syncretic America. And that is based on three components. The first one is the old indigenous Amerindian and Inuit tradition. And the second one is based on the slave tradition of cohabitation. And that was basically slaves could not marry. And when slavery was abolished, or when slaves eloped, they very often reverted to a matrifocal system with a woman and her children, and any man would be welcome for as long as he can maintain economically, as he can maintain the family in an economic way. When he stopped contributing, then he got the boot, and the woman was looking for another partner to fulfill that role. So, but it was basically cohabitation with varying partners, depending on and their survival, the partner's survival in that household would depend on his contribution. And then the third layer is what the European immigrants brought, the Spanish and the Portuguese mainly, and that's the European conjugal model. And not only that, but also the Catholic version of it. And that remained, of course, the dominant model for the upper classes, the white upper classes in Latin America. But that model was also the reference model for the others. And so you see that there is, during the first half of the 19th century, an effect of embourgeoisement. That is, even though you would not belong to the European elite, you would want to show that you have made it in life, then you would have a typical conjugal model celebration in a church. And so that model lasted also until about the 1950s, the 1960s. Thereafter, we will see a major change. And then last but not least, the sub-Saharan African system, that's exactly the opposite of the first one. Here we have bride wealth instead of a dowry. Bride wealth means that it is the boy, that it is the future groom who has to pay a certain amount of money, or who has to render some services to the family, to the lineage of his future bride. So the flow goes exactly in the opposite direction. Now, Africa is known for its multiple forms of partnership, and polygyny, classic polygyny, is one of them. Concubinage is another one. The new house is, or the little house is it. Another one, the little house, refers to the fact that in regions with a lot of labor migration, the man would have two houses, two households, one at the place of origin and one at the place of destination. And then the lineages can be virilocal or matrilocal, patrilinear or matrilinear, but women always remain member of their own lineage, again, in stark contrast to what happens in the Asian situation. So the rest of the talk will be structured according to these four layers that are distinguished right here. So let's start with system number one, the European conjugal one. Well, here we will be noticing a clear distinction between the northern and the western parts of Europe, with an early takeoff versus eastern and the southern parts of Europe with a later takeoff of cohabitation. And the debate at the onset was one of the POD, that is the pattern of poverty, being a dominant one and being seen as an alternative to the second demographic transition version. But we will now comment on that and see whether that holds and what we have to remember right here. In all the slides pertaining to the European conjugal system, I have used a standard definition, and I have tried to capture an indicator of cohabitation where cohabitation is already a more established form of living together, of partnership. And therefore, I have selected the women 25 to 29. That is, short-term dating is already over mostly for these older women. And I've also measured, I've also picked up the women who have had been cohabiting for at least 1 year among all the women, all women in a union that is married or cohabiting, who have been in that union for at least 1 year. So what I'm catching here is the firmer, more established form of cohabitation. Before going into detail, here we see the development in a very neat way. Starting from 1960 all the way till the beginning of the 21st century, you see that the Northern and the Western European nations have a much earlier takeoff and make it already to very high levels in the age group 25 to 29 for those who have been in the union for at least one year. So the top one is a typical Scandinavian one, that's Norway, and the bottom one in that group is Germany. And then you see southern and eastern ones. The top one is Spain, and the bottom three are, I think, Romania, Italy, and Poland, with a very, very slow development in that particular respect. A funny thing was noticed for Russia, who started up in the 1960s as having quite a bit of cohabitation, and then it declines. That's the one at the top in 1960, and then it bounces back, of course, after the years after the 1980s, and very often after 1985, even preceding the change and the fall of the Soviet Empire. So that's a very clear distinction. But that distinction corresponds also to something else, which tells us something more about family formation in the European context. And here I found a figure by a Dutch colleague produced in 2020, the latest possible figures available at that time. And it measures through a life table technique the percent of men at age 25 who are still living in the parental home. And if you look at the Scandinavians, I mean, it's minute. I mean, all men have left the parental home. 9%, 9%, 17, and 14% in Denmark. So it's a system where you move out of the parental home and you move actually quite quickly and almost universally into a cohabiting union. There may be a spell that in between of living alone or living in a dorm or co-sharing, but the movement into cohabitation is very, very clear as well. So that's one systemic difference that the Scandinavians have had for quite a long time by now. And then there is a second group, and that's made up typically of the Western European countries, from Germany, the Low Countries, England, Ireland, France, Austria, Switzerland, and that's about between 20 and 40% of young men at age 25 who are still living in the paternal home. And then, of course, at the other extreme, you have the Eastern and the Southern European phenomenon, where the feathered nest lasts for a long time. And there you see that the young men stay at home, and you find that percentages between 60 and 85%, 86% in the case of Slovakia. So this is the well-known Mediterranean and Eastern Europe, and also now Eastern European pattern of home living, with a much later takeoff of cohabitation. So, having pointed this out, now let's look in a little bit more detail what happened in the Western European pattern. Early rises typical for France, Belgium, and Germany, immediately following the Scandinavian ones. But here, if you look at the educational level, the takeoff of cohabitation from the 1960s at the bottom to the first 5 years of the 21st century at the top, by low, medium, and high education. There you see that it's always the highest education ones who are in the vanguard, who are in the lead, all the way through. Right here at the beginning, in the 60s and the 70s, It's this rebellious generation of university students who were the hippies and the provos and who wanted to change everything, who were very secularized, who were the post-materialist vanguard, who are also the ones who are taking off. And that group, actually, that high educated group, remains in the lead. If you look at Southern Europe, then you have contrasts between the leader of that group, that's Spain, and Italy, which is one of the ones that remains way behind. And in Spain, it really is only the highest education that start taking off a little bit more than the rest in the 1990s and the first bit of the 21st century. And as you can see in Italy, it's a very, very late rise, and it's after an initial jump, a little tiny jump here at high education, then it's only catching up at the lower education end as well. But that it clearly illustrates how big the differences can be. Now, if you go back to this one, or to this one, or to the United Kingdom, and Norway would, in the Scandinavians one, have a very typical pattern like that. There you see there are hardly any differences by education, but very strong differences between the timing over the changes over time. They're much, much larger than the contrast between the pattern of disadvantage and the SDT. So it's both occurring at the same time, and the overall change is much more important than the distinction between the POD and the SDT. And now if you look then to Eastern Europe, now there we have a different story. That's not only Bulgaria, but we also have the data for Romania and for Russia and for a number of other Eastern European ones. And then we see that there is a typical V-shape emerging, not at the onset. At the onset, you really see that indeed the pattern of disadvantage seems to be taking off first at the low education, at the low educated end. And that pattern takes off after the 1980s, so from the green one, the green line onwards. But what is now happening later on, that is especially in the 21st century, at the onset of the 21st century, that is a catching up at the high end, with the middle end being the lowest. So there's a V-shape developing right there. And of course, the changes here at the over time are again more important than the differences between the education groups. So the conclusion for the European cohabitation gradients by education is the overall rise is often much larger than the difference by education. So that points out that there has been a rapid diffusion across all social classes. So the Western European type is SDT and POD, with SDT in the leading. In Eastern Europe, it's the POD which is in the leading, but the SDT is now catching up, and that translates into this V-shape. Other parts of the European system are the new Europes, like the United States or Canada or Australia or New Zealand. And there we see, of course, that there is also a gradient by education. And I have the data from the census in 1990, in 20, and in a large survey, large surveys which were conducted between 2007 to 2011, the American Community Surveys, and we've taken the average, we pooled all these surveys together to come up with this particular gradient right here. But now the indicator is again women 25 to 29 who are in a cohabitation as a percentage of women of the same age group, obviously, who are in a union, that is cohabiting and married. So what you have here is the share of cohabitation in these unions of women aged 25 to 29. And as you can see, the lower end, the less than completed high school, that is in the vanguard, but the high school or some college has been catching up to almost the same level, but there has also been quite an increase at BA or higher. So there again, it's the higher educated who are not completely left behind in the United States. Quite the contrary has been the case. And if we look at the literature at the very early end for the 1970s, there we see that in fact, the phenomenon started among college students who started cohabiting. So on the total, you see that over in a period of, let's say, about a bit less than 20 years, the proportion cohabiting 25 to 29, the share of that has doubled in the United States. And so we have the same for Canada. There's only one exception in Canada, that is that the level in Quebec province is much, much higher than in the rest of Africa. But what is also typical for the US is that there is a marked sorting effect. That is, we have also the proportions over the various cohorts at the various ages. And in the age group 20 to 25, there is hardly any difference by education. They all start out at very much the same level. But the higher educated move faster into marriage subsequently. And that explains that by the time that we reach 25 to 29, their levels are still a little bit lower than that of the less educated. Another feature in the United States is that it's not necessarily the Black community that leads with cohabitation. The whites have been catching up, and so the race component has flattened off as well, and there is only a tendency of the Hispanics to have a bit less cohabitation than the whites and the non-Hispanic whites and the Black population. Now, system 2, and that's a very interesting one. That's the Latin American with the multiple sources. There we have a very strong ethnical component. The American Indians of the pre-Columbian times must have had very different systems right here. And that's why I said contrasting the native traditions with a little star, because we are going to look in a minute at the Mexican example, for which we can document this to some extent. And so the effect of slavery, I've already spoken to that, that also led very clearly to forms of cohabitation. And we also find all the way through that the pattern of disadvantage among the rural and the urban poor is very strong and much stronger than in Europe, of course, in all the Latin American cases. And one must not also forget that the class differentials in terms of income and in terms of levels of standards of living are much starker in the Latin American countries. So the POD there is a classic phenomenon that we find. But what we also see is, what we also try to inspect is whether the SDT is catching up after the 1970s and is now spreading to the better educated, who were formerly adhering to the European type of marriage, the Catholic type of marriage, which was very hostile to cohabitation. Let's have a look at Mexico to see if we can, you see a lot of lines here, but the story is very simple. There is enormous heterogeneity. I mean, there are ethnic groups in the 1930s, that's as far as we can go back, censuses of the 1930s in Mexico already measured uniones consensuales, that is the proportion, that is the number of women and men living in consensual unions. And we have them by language spoken, so we can identify the tribe to which, the original tribe to which they belong. Language other than Spanish, of course. And so you see here, right at the top, you have tribes with 70%, 90% of all women, that's irrespective of age groups, we don't have them by age group, unfortunately, in the 1930s, who are living in cohabiting unions. And right at the bottom, there you find groups who are barely at 10%, or even less than 10%, who are living in consensual unions. So the story that all of these groups lived in consensual unions is far from correct. In fact, a majority of them had, in the 1930s, were around 20 to 30% of women, all women above, I think, age 16, living in consensual unions. And you also see the embourgeoisement effect. Many of these lines go down. That is, marriage became more proponent and cohabitation declined. Only after 1990 did it start rising again, and particularly here in the large groups who are here at the bottom. And I would like to draw one particular attention here, that is to the bottom group mentioned in the list, that's the Mayas. who were the very large, of course, pre-Columbian kingdoms and civilizations, who were structured by castes. So you had a royal caste, you had a priestly caste, you had a caste of warriors, you had a caste of artisans, and these were even further divided. And so it's very likely that they had endogamous marriage because they also wanted to maintain their prerogatives and their priorities, and free choice would be a mésalliance, would be a mismatch. And so that's probably why the Yucatan group of the Mayas were there at the bottom. We will see a similar phenomenon that is in South America. That is, if you go to the highlands of South America, then there's also a drop in cohabitation. And these were precisely the areas that belong to the Inca pre-Columbian empire. So there is a hypothesis, but I cannot, of course, not completely do that for lack of historical data that go far enough to predict pre-Columbian times. But my hypothesis would be that indeed, as societies were very complex, from very simple agriculture, as here in the northern tribes mentioned in Mexico, to very complex agriculture and very complex social structures, that then marriage comes in and cohabitation goes down. But on the whole, you see after 1990, Mexico as a whole joins the overall trend. If you look at just 10 years difference, the census round of 2000 and the census round of 2010, thanks to the diligent work of my colleagues in Barcelona, we can map it by very, very small regions. Anything slightly pink is above 50% of women in the age group 25 to 29 living in cohabitation. And less than 50%, of course, the complement living in a married union. And you can really see how the red spreads dramatically in Southern America, and also to some extent in Canada, and particularly here in Quebec, the northern most parts here, the very red at the very top in Canada are of course the Inuit. But what is lagging behind in the whole development of the whole of the Americas is the United States. The United States is by all means the most conservative country when it comes to cohabitation on the whole continent. And when you would compare it with Western and Northern Europe, also there, it would be a more conservative mark, somewhere high, a little bit higher than but lower than Spain, a little bit higher than the rest of the Mediterranean. So which is a remarkable phenomenon, given that in fact it's a new Europe, so to speak. Now, let's document a couple of Latin American features. And let's take a classic, that's Panama, which had less than primary education women all the way through from 1970 to 1910, always had cohabitation as the dominant portion. So there's hardly any possibility for a further rise. They were already very high right there. But in all the other education categories, there is a vast increase, and the largest increase is at the university completed part. So it's definitely a pre-existing POD pattern, but with a second demographic transition pattern moving in full force after the 1970s. Another one, and somewhat the opposite, is there is a relatively weak POD effect to start with, but is very rapidly developing since 1970. Whereas the second demographic transition one in Brazil increases to a much lesser degree. And also in Venezuela, we find a similar pattern. These are the two countries with that pattern, where the increase among university educated is not one of the largest ones. And instead, the one at the bottom end of the social scale is the most pronounced one. Colombia is one where everything moves more or less at the same time. Large increases all over. There are also a number of countries that more or less fit that form. Argentina, Chile are more or less in that category. And then there is one new Europe, actually. Uruguay has only Italians and Spanish and German populations, where there is a real landslide. a typical POD pattern to start with at the less than primary, a small catching up at the university. But then between 1996 and 2010, in 14 years, everybody moves to about 70%. That's the single largest increase in cohabitation found in the whole of the American continent. All right, system 3, the East Asian patterns. Well, obviously, as you have seen, China, Japan, Taiwan fit the historical patriarchal phenomenon, and the Philippines were a Spanish colony and then later American colony, and so are largely Catholic except for the very south. And so the patriarchal system is hostile towards cohabitation. And when I started looking at cohabitation in the 1980s, I thought, well, I mean, the Far East, the patriarchal societies, at least historically, even China, despite its long communist history, would not be candidates at all for cohabitation. And when I was at a seminar in 2003 in Tokyo, and I said, well, sort of very shyly, I asked the question, is there any cohabitation here in Japan? The answer was, oh no. I said, has anybody asked the question? And the answer came, oh no, that would be a very impolite question. Well, a couple of years thereafter, there was a newspaper who was very adventurous and did ask the question. And then, of course, it was revealed that there had been a takeoff of cohabitation in Japan. And then, until, of course, Yuxi and Jiayu started analyzing and publishing the results from their large Chinese survey, then, of course, we also, what we had expected, that in large urban areas, there would, of course, be cohabitation taking off, given the fact that social control would be much weaker under such circumstances, and that cohabitation would have economic advantages as well. And that's, of course, exactly what happened. But there are two characteristics, and the same thing for Taiwan. There are actually two characteristics, that it is that these countries are probably in a takeoff phase, and we do not know how fast they have been evolving, unless, of course, we analyze data that are later than 2007 or 2010, and then we were catching the latest figures to see whether this has developed any further. And so there's a takeoff phase in these three countries, and this is what Jim Ramo called, that is a careful change, in the sense that none of these three have a large number of children born in cohabitation. If there is a pregnancy, and there are pregnancies occurring in cohabitation, witness that in Japan, then of course there is a marriage interfering, and I think that also in China, shotgun marriages must be on the rise. The Philippines is a different story, given its Catholic inheritance. So that's more or less, in short, says what the story is here. And if you look at it in Japan, you can read that this is a very interesting table that I took from James Ramo, and that's the large survey of 2009 in Japan. If you look at what is the first event of these three that women 20 to 24 experienced, and that by education, then at junior high school, it's the cohabitation, which is the first event that they experience, with a conception. And marriage is the third one. If you look at university, it's of course exactly the opposite. Very few conceptions is the first one. Only about a quarter start off with cohabitation, and the vast majority, more than two-thirds, start off with marriage. So you see that there are very, very different patterns here according to social class, and that as late as 2009. So the Japanese pattern is very much a POD pattern and not a second demographic transition one, although if we look at the changes, and here look at the figures in the blue box, although by age you also see phenomenal increases. If you look at the percent ever cohabited among those ever in a union, by age group, then in the age group 55 plus, hardly anybody ever cohabited, who were ever in the union, and virtually all of these women 55 plus are or were in the union. And then it trickles up all the way to about 37% of those ever in the union who are ever cohabiting, and who are ever pregnant or had a birth, or it's basically ever pregnant because there are few births. Among those who are ever married and who are pares, then you also see that there's a vast increase to almost half of them in the 25 to 29 group who had a premarital pregnancy. So the shotgun marriages in Japan, and there are Japanese words for that, you know, Japanese have sort of derogatory words for all these things. Shotgun marriages in Japan are part and parcel of the story. If we look at the People's Republic of China, and these are the data from USSP and GIU, but I have them only for all women. So a large number of women are still single, and we have to be careful. I mean, they're added to the denominator here, and so that distorts the picture to some extent, compared to all the other data that I have shown, who were relative only to women in the union. So that's why I put the figures in parentheses from the age group 20 to 24, because in the middle, high school and college, there are too many singles here in the denominator that suppress these figures. But if we start looking at 25 to 29, where the number of singles is already dwindling, then you really see, you know, from 7% to a third among college educated are cohabiting among all these women. 18% to 35% with high school. And what is lagging behind is basically at the lower end of the scale, from 11% to only 25% and 27% here. So there is there tends to be a split here that materializes basically in the age group 25 to 29, where the higher educated are leading the dance towards cohabitation. But it should be said again that if there is a pregnancy, and there are probably many pregnancies in this particular case, shotgun marriages do interfere. And so it's the prudent path of cohabitation, which is followed by these three Far East Asian countries. The Philippines is, of course, a different story, given that it's Catholic, and the Catholic Church has been waging war against cohabitation. And so you have to see that in that line. And let's also look at 2000 at the blue box here, because this is also only for women in the union, married, cohabiting, 25 to 29, by education. And then again, you see no education is not the highest, and higher education is as high as the no education. It's actually in the middle groups that we find in 2013, that is the most recent data that we have, that even up to 40% are in cohabitation, with 60 to 70% being married in the age group 25 to 29. So it's sort of the middle group here, which is leading the dance. And the same is very clear also if we look at wealth quintiles. It's the poorest and the highest who tend to be lagging behind in the 2013 survey, and the middle groups who are ahead. And then we look at the fourth group, the fourth category, Sub-Saharan Africa and its variations. Just listed the variations, but we're going to focus on cohabitation, of course, because it has a particular characteristic that stands out if we compare it with all the rest. There is the classic exogamous marriage, and that is bride will is paid, but almost always in installments. That is, the family of the groom pays a bit at one point because, I mean, they see that something is happening, or they like the pair being formed, and then they pay a bit more to the woman's lineage, and then a bit more. And then at one point, some of much of the payment or enough payments have been made, and then they decide that marriage will be an event, and then a Christian marriage or a religion marriage occurs, but the bride wealth is not necessarily fully paid. And so very often you have discussions about, whether it was enough or not enough. But it always goes in the direction from the groom to the bride, to future bride. Classic polygyny, and is a typical characteristic of gerontocratic control. You can only have men monopolizing women, and if the men are wealthy enough, and so they are older men, and they're monopolizing of necessity younger women. So there are very large age gaps between the two. And the losers in this system are younger men who don't have enough partners to go around because they're in polygynous, caught in the polygynous unions of the oldies. But gerontocratic control in African societies is weakening quite rapidly, actually. And so that's why the classic form of co-wives living in compound together with their husband, that classic polygyny is declining. There is already since quite some time an increase in concubinage, but that's an illicit affair. So the man is married, but he has what they call in French deuxième bureau, or in English a second office somewhere else, and that's the classic concubine phenomenon. There is actually a nice West African song about the young man who is wealthy enough that he can have a second office, only when he discovered later on that he is the third office of that second office wife. Cohabitation has a very interesting characteristic. It is monogamous and it avoids the payment of bride wealth. And that's a crucial phenomenon, because who has advantage at not paying bride wealth? And it turns out to be the best educated men. The expectations that they will pay large bride wealths are very high, given that they are educated, given that they are going to be at the top of the social stratification. The lineage of the woman is expecting a large amount of bride wealth to be paid to them. And the way for younger men to avoid that is precisely by cohabitation. And so that's why we find that in West Africa, at least, cohabitation has more of a second demographic transition characteristic than a POD one. And then, of course, I already talked about it, the small house, that's typical for labor migration areas, particularly in Southern Africa. Ready, willing, and able, these are the conditions for any new form of behavior. Readiness says there must be an advantage of cohabitation, an advantage of the new form over marriage. And so it has lower entry costs, this mentioned here, but it has lower exit costs, it has greater partner independence, and it has more egalitarian gender relationships. These are the advantages, typical advantages that speak to the readiness. But that's not enough. There must be also enough willingness. That is, there must be a weakened ethical or religious objections to cohabitation, and cohabitation then is probably seen as part of a more overall or a larger ethics revolution, and I will show that in a minute. And then there must also be ability, that is the legal code, the cohabitation must be a legal form. In the United States, for instance, in a number of states, it was completely illegal to form a cohabiting household. It was not only sinful according to the religious, but also to the legal authorities. In a number of states, cohabitation was an illegal affair. Now, these three phenomena, these three conditions, preconditions, must be met at the same time. If one is lagging behind, then the phenomenon will not materialize. And the one, I think, which is crucial here is the willingness. And where can we see how willingness evolves? And there I took a look at the world values studies, and I looked at other features, at other forms of behavior, which was strongly disapproved of. It was a strong disapproval of homosexuality, of abortion, of divorce, of euthanasia, and of suicide. These were stigmatized, strongly stigmatized features in all societies to start with. If we would have measured that in the 1940s or the 1950s, the stigma would be very, very strong. And what I've measured here is the strength of that stigma by adding the proportion of people, 18 to 64, so it's across all ages, who say that homosexuality is never justified under no circumstance. Idem for abortion. So even if in case of rape, abortion would still not be justified. Divorce, even in the case of adultery or divorce, will not be justified. Euthanasia, never justified, and suicide, never justified. And so I added the proportions of never justified for these 5 up. And so that's why the scale goes up, the vertical scale goes up to 500. If you divide by 5, you get the average proportion, never justified. That is the strength of the negative view. As you move up, you will see that that strength becomes much more pronounced. And who is at the bottom? The typical Scandinavian countries, Sweden, Norway, and Finland, are at the far right part. And so if you divide by 5, you will see that you will get something like an average of 20% would think that this is never justified. 80% would not at all have such a stigmatized and such a strong view on it. Slightly higher are the ones who are slightly lower on cohabitation. These are the Western European ones: France, the Netherlands, Germany, and Switzerland. Who was still more strict? Spain and Italy. And we know, you have seen the difference in cohabitation between Spain and Italy. Italy being completely at the bottom and Spain being on the lead in the whole of Southern Europe. Who is then is a little bit more towards the conservative end? All the Anglo-Saxon countries. Canada, US, Great Britain, Australia, New Zealand, more conservative than the Western European ones, as we also see very clearly in their cohabitation figures. And who is more strict? There we have the Eastern European ones: Romania, Bulgaria, Poland, Ukraine, Russia, and Serbia. And who comes next? The Latin American ones. But the Latin American ones, of course, had the great advantage that they had the POD pattern of cohabitation at the onset. So they had the historical component that adds to their cohabitation, but not so much their ethical changes. But what is also very clear right here, remember Uruguay and its big jump? Well, here is Uruguay. It's the most lenient one, the least negative one on these phenomena. So from that point of view, it's even more modern than the Southern European ones and the Eastern European ones. Then, of course, we move to the East Asian ones, the non-Buddhist and the the non-Hindu and the non-Muslim ones. So Buddhist plus Confucianism and another Taoism mixed in, or in Japan, other elements being mixed in. Then it's very clear that in terms of the ethics revolution, China is not the vanguard. It is Japan. And so that contrasts. I don't know how this will play out, given that we are only in the takeoff phase of cohabitation. But the other candidates, actually, that is South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Chinese populations also, to a large extent, who may have now increases in cohabitation as the next candidates. And Thailand, as a Buddhist country, may also be a candidate, and we have to watch that in the near future. So then we move to an Hindu country, largely Hindu country, India, and then all the Islamic countries. And you see that the ethics revolution has not taken place there, maybe a bit in Malaysia, and was quite surprised that Malaysia as a Muslim country was that liberal in these respects. So these are probably not going to have an experience in cohabitation in the next decade or so, or at least that would be another surprise. But we have seen surprises. In 2000, I did not expect China and Japan having a takeoff. So to stop and to conclude, a total effect, you should always distinguish at least between a built-in historical effect, a POD and an SDT effect. Global overall rises in Europe and the Americas are quite noticeable, and not yet in Muslim and Hindu patriarchal societies. There's going to be strong resistance there, given that they are not participating yet in the ethics revolution. The Buddhist and Confucian, that is to see what is going to happen, I think, in the next 10 years. They have not asked the question in Thailand, but they may think that they will do in one of the next surveys. Japan are in the People's Republic of China, and the Philippines are in the takeoff phase with low extramarital fertility maintained, but probably, like in Japan, a rise in shotgun marriages. The old and the new Europes fully developing, but with with regional differences, fast evolution in northern and western, and slower evolution in eastern, southern, and USA. Syncretic America, all phenomena are occurring at the same time, and the SDT is clearly emerging after 1970. And in sub-Saharan exogamous cases, probably a decline of classic polygyny and a rise of cohabitation, because it cuts short of the obligation of paying bride wealth. So that was probably too long, but at least now we have an overview of what's happening in the world and how historical patterns are still strongly conditioning what is occurring. So thank you very much indeed. Questions? Oh, that's, if you want to see the United States, if there's a question about the US, I can show the map later on. Okay, yeah. That's it.
So thanks a lot for Professor Lesthaeghe's wonderful talk.
Yeah, I need the...
Yeah. So let's welcome our discussant, Professor James Ramo, who is Professor of Sociology from Princeton University, and he is expert of demography of East Asian society. So let's also welcome Professor Ramo to give his comments on Professor Lesthaeghe's keynote speech.
Okay, thank you, Jia. Ron, can I ask you to unshare so I can share a screen as well?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question, Jim?
Yeah, could you unshare your screen so I could share mine?
Oh, yes, of course.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, does that look all right?
Yes.
Okay, well, so let me begin by saying that it's a real honor to be able to share a few words and thoughts on cohabitation following Professor Lesthaeghe's incredibly comprehensive and really fascinating talk. I particularly enjoyed the sort of historical focus, and particularly the thinking about the heterogeneity and the meaning and the nature of cohabitation and how it's varied across both time and space. So again, like much of his work, a real thought-provoking, a real stimulating set of ideas and data. So I appreciate the talk, and like I said, the opportunity to share a few thoughts. Let's see, hang on just a sec. Was going to start by spending a bit of time recognizing Professor Lesthaeghe's contributions to family demography or the field of demography more broadly. But Jia did such a good job of summarizing the many contributions and awards that Professor Lesthaeghe has won. So I'll just take a very brief minute to provide a little bit of personal background to supplement the very sort of broad professional background. I started graduate school the year that Professor Lesthaeghe's most well-cited paper was published, the sort of second demographic transition overview chapter in the volume that everybody is familiar with. And his work has been with me for the past 25 years and has really informed the way that I and many of us, probably all of us on this talk or in this session, think about low fertility, think about family change over time. So as I said, this has been really profoundly impactful on my own work, and I've greatly enjoyed the opportunities, the sporadic opportunities over the years to meet with Professor Lesthaeghe at PAA or wherever, or to exchange ideas by email about the way in which family change is taking place in East Asia. So I want to spend a little bit of time here. I'm going to be very brief. I want to leave time for questions, but spend a little bit of time talking about what I know best, which is the East Asian context, System 3 in Professor Lesthaeghe's talk. And I hope what I have to say isn't repetitive. I'm going to try to provide some of the very newest data, unpublished data from both Japan and China, to supplement some of what Ron was talking about, and to hopefully think about some of these broader patterns in the context of the newest data. So very briefly, I don't think that this is really something that I need to talk about with most of us here, but when we think about the second demographic transition and we think about this notion of universality, the East Asian context has always presented a real challenge, right? Because there are certain things that look a lot like the second demographic transition. There are other things that don't look like the second demographic transition. And as Professor Lesthaeghe was saying, one of those that really doesn't look like the second demographic transition is the continued strength of the relationship between marriage and childbearing. And in the context of this really tight link between marriage and childbearing in the East Asian context, cohabitation, our understanding of the levels of cohabitation, the meaning of cohabitation, and how that evolves over time becomes critically important. And as he mentioned, there has been a real striking growth in cohabitation, and I'll show you a little more on that. But I really like this idea of thinking about different types of cohabitation, the second demographic transition type, the pattern of disadvantage type, rapid diffusion, historical types. And what I'm going to suggest is that maybe we have differences. I think actually Professor Lesthaeghe suggested this as well, comparing China and Japan, which is what I'll do, that you have both within one regional setting, East Asia. So let me just show you a few slides real briefly. These are new data from Japan. These are married women. So these are all married women. And basically, and by the way, I should note that these are, I'm not the only one involved. This is part of a large team effort with the colleagues listed down in the bottom left of this slide here. But basically, this shows two marriage cohorts, the blue earlier, the orange more recent. And you can see this is the proportion of married women who cohabited prior to marriage. You can see that about half of women in the lowest half of the education distribution have cohabited before marriage in Japan in recent cohorts. And consistent with Professor Lesthaeghe's depiction of potentially a pattern of disadvantage, you see a negative educational gradient here. China is quite different. These are figures from Jiayu and Yuxia, not from the 2015 PDR article, but more recent data from the China Family Panel study. And you can see here, again, these are birth cohorts, not marriage cohorts. And these are all women, not married women, but you see this large increase over time comparing the blue and the orange in a very short period of time. And you see a positive educational gradient here, with the exception of the most highly educated. So again, as Professor Lesthaeghe said, consistent with this idea of the second demographic transition. So the point I want to make here is that even if this isn't the modal experience, it's getting close to a modal experience in these two East Asian countries. And what's really important, as I was suggesting, is thinking about relationships between cohabitation and childbearing or pregnancy, as Professor Lesthaeghe really, I think, aptly pointed out in these countries where childbearing outside of marriage remains essentially nil. But basically what we have here, again, are marriage cohorts ranging from the mid-90s, late 90s to the very recent period of time. And these are all married women, again. And I've divided marriages into four groups. Conventional marriages, blue. You marry and then childbearing, pregnancy and childbearing. The gray, shotgun marriages, pregnant before marriage, marry in response to the pregnancy. Orange, cohabitation prior to marriage without pregnancy, and yellow, cohabitation with pregnancy prior to marriage. And basically what you can see now is that the modal pathway to marriage is not the conventional pathway of just marrying prior to pregnancy. The modal pathway involves some combination of pregnancy and cohabitation, which I think is really, again, quite striking and gives us some food for thought about thinking about how this might evolve in the future. For China, again, from Jiayu and Yuxia, these are data showing birth cohorts, again, not marriage cohorts, but birth cohorts, and a slightly different set of data. These show the relationship between cohabitation and experience of premarital conception on the left and premarital birth on the right. And basically what you can see is that in all birth cohorts, those who cohabited prior to marriage were more likely to have a premarital conception and a premarital birth. While the relationship with premarital births has weakened over time, you can see very clearly that the relationship between cohabitation experience and premarital conception has increased over time. So again, food for thought in terms of thinking about the meaning of cohabitation in these two countries. In summary, I want to just highlight the fact that there's been incredibly rapid growth, as Professor Lesthaeghe indicated, in cohabitation in these countries. I think it's really important to realize that these are all relatively, not all, often relatively short in duration and often are a precursor to marriage. So a little bit different than a second demographic transition picture of cohabitation as something that may be occasionally or often an alternative to marriage. And we note that cohabitation in East Asia appears to be increasingly a setting for pregnancy, but not birth. Again, in contrast to what we might see in the European context or elsewhere. And with respect to the socioeconomic differences, to me, this is absolutely fascinating. In an earlier article, we found relatively limited educational differences in cohabitation in Japan. But from those figures I showed you, that's no longer the case. And we see this real strong negative gradient consistent with this pattern of disadvantage potentially, as Professor Lesthaeghe indicates. So these are some of the ideas that we're thinking about right now in our collaborative research on these countries. And I really appreciate the opportunity to share some of this new data in the context of what was just a fascinating, broad-ranging and historically informed talk by Professor Lesthaeghe. So again, thank you for the opportunity to share these thoughts.
Very nice.
Thank you, Professor Rebo. Then let's open the session for questions. I noticed that there are 3 people who post their questions on the other side. So the first one is Xu Hongwei. Do you want to ask the question by yourself? I can unmute you. Yeah, Hongwei, now you can talk.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. I just have a quick question. So what role, if any, does affordable housing play in shaping the trend of cohabitation across these different systems or different countries? Thank you.
Can I hear the question again? What does?
How does affordable housing?
Oh yes.
Yeah.
I think it does play a role, particularly in large cities, in terms of the advantage of of cohabiting in order to cut the costs of housing. I mean, one of the advantages of cohabitation is that it lowers the overall cost by sharing them. So there's an economies of scale that is at work right here. So, and if housing is very high, I would see that as a stimulus towards cohabiting rather than living alone. Does that answer the question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so the second question is raised by Maria Lesthaeghe, and you can talk now, Maria.
Okay, thank you very much, and thanks to Ron for his very insightful presentation. I was wondering whether data are fully comparable across regions, because as you mentioned, cohabitation has different meanings across region. And secondly, I was very shocked and surprised to see the big differences between Italy and Spain. So maybe it would be nice to elaborate a little bit if data are really comparable in this case, or thank you.
Okay.
Yes,
Maria. Yes, Maria. Well, all the data are directly comparable for the European countries. So Italy and Spain and all the others, it's exactly the same source of the data. It's the GGS surveys, and the measurement is exactly the same in all these cases. So that makes it maximum comparability. I'm not surprised by the difference between Italy and Spain. After the fall of the Franco regime, Spain went through a rapid secularization phase. And it's measured, it can be measured very, very clearly in terms of belief, in terms of church attendance, sort of what was called Cristiano-fascism fell apart with Franco. Italy is still the hub of Catholicism. Catholicism is basically an Italian religion. And so secularization in Italy is much, much less pronounced. And it also shows in the other ethical the dimensions that I showed. Italy is much more conservative than Spain is. So don't be surprised. I don't think I'm the only one who noticed that. Also my Spanish colleagues have already commented on that in exactly the same direction. Now, the Latin American figures are all comparable as well. Now, the Asian ones are not directly comparable to the former two groups because I didn't have the raw data to manipulate them and to change them in exactly the configuration I wanted to. If I would have wanted them, I would have wanted them comparable to the Latin American ones because that's the easiest thing to do. That is the proportion of women 25 to 29 cohabiting versus the proportion being married. That's the very simplest and robust indicator of cohabitation, other than just very early cohabitation as a form of early courtship. If you want to measure early forms of courtship, then take the age group 20 to 25. If you want the firmer, more established form, the age group 25 to 29 is the better one.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay. Yeah, so the third question is raised by Hu Xiyuan, and now you can talk, Hu.
Okay, thank you for your presentation. Can you introduce the likely cohabitation rate of homosexuals and heterosexuals? Thank you, Professor.
Well, I have to apologize. I haven't looked into that matter. Obviously, the ability factor in the case of homosexual couples plays a very major role. That is, to what extent is homosexuality punishable by law or not? So the third condition would be very, very important. At least as far as the measurement of such couples and cohabitation. My hypothesis would be that, of course, homosexual couples are less likely to cohabit than that homosexual couples are more likely to cohabit than heterosexual couples for the major reason that there is still a strong stigma against them, and in many cases it would be illegal to form a couple, a homosexual couple in most countries, certainly in the Islamic world and in the Hindu world.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, so the first question, Yuxi also have a question, and you can just directly talk.
Hi, Ron. Thanks for giving the presentation. I'm sorry you couldn't be in China in person, but I would like to extend the invitation that you can come to China, visit the CSR, and stay for a short while. I know you're retired. You can travel. So this is an open invitation. You can come and spend time in Beijing at Peking University. I actually have two broad questions. One, I'm a little bit surprised. The first, I'm a little bit surprised by your distinction of traditional family patterns between Europe and East Asia. To me, there are more similarities than differences compared to Latin America and Africa. So I was a little bit surprised by your distinction. Then I will talk why I'm surprised. You can look at a broader question. the second demographic theory that he proposed seems to say that we are deviating from traditional pattern of marriage. But from a broader historical perspective, one could say marriage was abnormality, was unusual, was socially constructed. And you can take a look from a Marx point of view, Karl Marx or Plato, that maybe marriage was unusual social construction. And why was marriage in the first place? So we are deviating from something that was constructed a long time ago. We are used to that, but maybe marriage itself in Europe and in East Asia was unusual, was a historical product. And what was that? The argument is that patriarchal marriage was unusual because it preserves the property and private property, and it's related to agriculture. In places where you don't have common property, the family is much weaker. Even in China, in Mongolia, or in border regions where there is no such private property and communal property, they don't see strong kind of marriage, patriarchal marriage, because there is no issue, that's the issue of who is the heir of your property. And so I think a lot of that happened even with Muslim and also Christian and East Asian confusion. A lot of those religions and cultures were created to preserve a property line, private property. So could you address with the broad issue why marriage in the first place historically? And also East Asia and Europe, similarities rather than differences.
Okay, well, that's a very fundamental question that has to take us back into history to quite an extent. I concur with you that marriage is a social construct. There is no doubt about it, and it deals directly with maintaining property or circulation of property within a smaller group. Whether it's a family group or whether it's a caste or a social class, that varies, of course, from situation to situation. I also, when I was discussing the differences in Mexico between these ethnic groups, I pointed out that the ones with small, intensive agriculture, whole agriculture, where property did not matter very much because there was no social stratification, that they are the cases with cohabitation, where marriage is more of a process, where everybody at one point accepts it. And in these cases, at least in the Mexican cases for which I found references in the anthropological literature, they also had bride wealth. That is, the only form of payment from the boy side to the girl side was just service on the land, helping out with her clan in cultivating small plots of land, or presenting little presents, for instance, results of hunting. And that's all. And it's cohabitation that prevails. And it's not marriage. Like in Africa, it's a process. It's not a single event. Single event is something that Islam and European Christianity added to the phenomenon. So that is very clear. Now, I'm not familiar with Mongolia and northern China and the land tenure system differences in China. I'm sure there must be quite substantial ones. So, and I'm not familiar enough with the history and the impact of these things right there. But what I've seen from classic Chinese literature is, of course, a marked patriarchal pattern, and it still shows, of course, in the preference for sons. The sex ratio is still very different in East Asia and higher in East Asia in favor of boys compared to Europe or anywhere else in the world, as one indicated of still, I think, a lasting difference. But the way China and Japan and Hong Kong and Taiwan and Singapore and Korea are moving are clearly into the direction of the Western pattern of individual choice of partners that may have already started to take place after after Mao. I really don't know. I would have to look into the detailed Chinese history right there, into the degrees of arranged marriages and free partner choice. But that is a precursor, I would say, of the second demographic transition phenomena that are also now emerging right here. It's not a complete SDT. It's maybe indeed, as Jim just said, an entry, a trial period before marriage. Whereas in Europe, it started out as a trial period before marriage into replacement of marriage. It was very clear that, I mean, at the onset, the levels of cohabitation were still modest because cohabitors married. Now they are much higher because cohabitors don't marry in Europe, and they don't even bother to marry when they have kids. So that's still a very big difference compared to the Asian situation. But I would have to be educated in much greater detail on this vast subcontinent, which is China with 1 billion inhabitants, and very stark regional differences. And I think it will be such a marvelous research topic for the whole of Chinese scholars in the social sciences to start documenting these differences by language, by all sorts of customs and of language, of lineage, family organization forms, and also currently by the degree of cohabitation and the degree to which sub-replacement fertility is manifesting itself. I'm sure there must be vast differences between the regions of China. I was already quite thrilled when I saw your paper and GIU's paper in Population and Development Review, because it was the very first paper that came out, at least outside China, in which there was a clear documentation of the pattern of cohabitation, which Jim just showed developed even further over the last couple of years. So I don't know whether this answers your... Oh yeah, to Europe I would like to say something else. It is clear that the Roman Empire had a very strongly patriarchal, an extremely strong patriarchal system. But we do not know whether this was the case for the Germanic tribes and the Celtic tribes at that time. And that's the other part of Europe. And I think that was not nearly as strong. And I even think that the Scandinavian pattern and the Icelandic pattern, because of its isolation, stems from these old Germanic patterns, where men and women were much more equal, and where women had quite a strong say in the matters, and were very different compared to the Roman one, to the Roman system. And another thing is that the Catholic Church, and that's the thesis of Jack Goody during the early Middle Ages, that is the years 700, 600, 700, when the monasteries were formed, that the church had a great advantage that the women would bring their dowry into the church rather than marrying. And if to avoid marrying, they had to sanction, they had to wage a war against arranged marriages among the nobility and among the better classes. And so if they would, if marriages could not be arranged, and in the Christian church, in the Catholic Church, it is a pact between, it's a sacrament. It's a pact between two individuals, not between two lineages. It's the man who says to the woman, with this ring, I thee marry. And no divorce. It's for life, for better, for worse, until death does us part. That's the classic formula. So the basis of conjugal marriage goes back in Europe to very clearly to the early Middle Ages and the monastic movement in the church. But there was big resistance against it, huge resistance against it, by nobility in particular, who obviously married between themselves and who had nothing but arranged marriages. And actually, one of the famous reasons why Henry VIII broke away from the Catholic Church in 1500 and so much was precisely because he wanted to get rid of what he called the dead hand of the church on property. Property that went to the church, that went to the monasteries, that was the dead hand of the church, that left the nobility and the aristocracy. That was a loss. And so he abolished all the monasteries, and so there was no longer a dead hand of the church in England. And that's why also the aristocracy survived much better in England than anywhere else in Europe. Well, that was a small digression, but it just shows how complex these matters really can be, as you indeed indicated.
Yeah, thank you, Professor. So because of the time limitation, we will only have one more question because we have already exceeded time. So actually, this question is from our audience from the live streaming in the Bilibili. His question is that divorce is not allowed in Philippines. So does it affect the premarital cohabitation?
Can you repeat that again, Gia? I didn't quite get it.
Yeah, the audience asks, so because divorce is not allowed in Philippines,
Yes.
so will that affect premarital cohabitation?
The Philippines is obviously a separate case in the whole of the Far East, given its long Christian tradition, and it's the middle group. There is literature in the Philippines that says that it is a POD pattern, but it is based on adding in the denominator all these single women at higher education. So of course the figures cohabiting among all women declines with education, simply because so many educated women are still single. If you look at it as a proportion of all these women, of all women in a union, then this is by no means the case. It's the middle group that is leading the vanguard of cohabitation. I don't have any idea about the fertility of cohabiting women in the Philippines. So again, I'm waiting for studies there to go into greater depth. But I would imagine that it is different from Japan and China, and that is that cohabitants would continue to have children within a cohabiting union to a greater extent.
Thank you, Professor. I'm so sorry that we cannot address all of your questions, and thanks for participating in this keynote speech. But I think if you have any further question, you may reach Professor Lesthaeghe by emailing him. So that's all for so that's all for today's keynote speech. Let's thank Professor Lesthaeghe. Thanks, Professor Jim Remo, as well as our students and staffs who help with this. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much indeed. That was a pleasure. Okay. One more thing to you, Xie.
Thank you.
Yes. No, but I wanted to say a little thing. Thank you for the invitation to China. But I'm 75 years old. I do have time, but I do have arthritis. So traveling is more difficult for me.
Okay.
Maybe we'll come see you.
Oh, that would be a good idea. That would be an excellent idea. Bring your data, please. Thank you, Jim. That was...
Thank you, Ron. That was wonderful.
Your extra data were really elucidating. And
I'll share those with you once we have something. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Thank you, GIU, for organizing everything and also for the help. Even when I was putting the Chinese data together, I know you were being contacted to provide these data originally. So also there, I have to thank you. I have long memory in this respect. So thanks for that.
Yeah, we can just share some further results. Thanks again, Professor Lesthaeghe, and we will end this session. Also we will say goodbye to the other audience.
Okay.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks for,
Bye.
Bye.
I will end this meeting.
Yeah.
Right. Thanks, Joe.
Thanks.